August 10th, 1944, Camp Ruston, Louisiana. The air hung thick and hot, smelling of pine sap and distant rain. Inside barrack, 720 German women sat frozen on their bunks, waiting for the worst. They had been told that Americans were monsters, that they would hurt them, starve them, humiliate them in ways too terrible to speak aloud. Then came a knock on the door. Boots echoed on wooden steps. The door creaked open. But what entered wasn't cruelty. It was kindness. Young American guards carrying wicker baskets, cigarettes, apples, and shiny bars of chocolate wrapped in brown paper. The women screamed at first, then they cried, because they couldn't believe kindness could taste this sweet. What happened next would change everything they thought they knew about their enemies, about their country, and about humanity itself. Stay with me till the end to hear the full story. Like, subscribe and share if you believe history's real power lies not in hate, but in the human heart. But to understand that knock on the door, we have to go back. Back to the desert. Back to the moment when Margareta Volker's world first began to crack. May 1943. The deserts of North Africa burned under a merciless sun. German troops, once proud and confident, were surrounded on all sides. The famous Afrika Korps, the same force that had pushed the British to the very edge of Egypt, was collapsing fast. Allied planes ruled the sky. Fuel was gone. Food was running out. Water came in drops, not cups. Among the soldiers were hundreds of young German women, nurses, radio clerks, secretaries, and support staff. Many were only in their early 20s. They had been told they were part of a grand mission, serving the fatherland, helping brave men fight for Europe's future. What they did not know was that they were about to see a very different world, one that their teachers and officers had sworn did not exist. By May 15, 1943, more than 250,000 Axis soldiers surrendered in Tunisia. The women were shocked. Back home, German radio had said they would rather die than be taken prisoner. That surrender was for cowards, that true Germans fought until the last bullet. Yet here they stood, hungry, dusty, and alive. Margareta Volker was 24 years old. Before the war, she had weighed 118 pounds. Now, standing in the heat with her hands raised above her head, she weighed 68. Her nurse's uniform hung off her shoulders like a tent. Her cheekbones pressed sharp against her skin. Her eyes, once bright and confident, had gone dull with exhaustion and fear. She had been a member of the Hitler Youth, a leader, in fact. She had believed every word they told her, that Germany was saving Europe, that the Jews were the enemy, that the Americans and British were weak, corrupt, and cruel. Now, surrounded by American soldiers who looked barely older than boys, she waited for cruelty. But it didn't come. A tall soldier with dust on his boots walked up to her group. He carried a canteen. He held it out. "Water," he said in English. "Drink." Margaret stared at the canteen like it was a snake. The other women looked to her. She was the senior nurse, the leader. What she did, they would do. She shook her head. She stepped back. "I would rather die," she said in German, loud enough for the others to hear, "than take charity from animals." The soldier didn't understand the words, but he understood the refusal. He shrugged, took a drink himself, and walked away. One of the younger nurses, a woman named Helga Brenner, watched him go. She whispered to Margaret, "He didn't look cruel." Margaret turned on her sharply. "That's what they want you to think. Don't be fooled." But even as she said it, something small and quiet turned over in her chest. A question she didn't want to ask. If they were animals, why did he offer water? They were gathered at a makeshift camp near the coast. Tents, guard towers, dust and heat. The women were separated from the men and placed in a cordoned section surrounded by barbed wire. Their minds were full of fear. Stories of torture, starvation, dishonor. Nazi propaganda had painted the Allies as monsters who delighted in cruelty, who killed prisoners for sport. A diary found years later, written by one of the nurses, carried this line, "We waited for cruelty. We were ready for humiliation. But the American soldiers only asked if we were thirsty. Instead of beatings, the women saw something they could not understand. Order, organization, and food. Real food. The Americans gave them water. Not a sip, but full canteens. They gave them white bread, soft and pillowy, a luxury none of the women had seen in months. Trucks brought tins of beans, crates of oranges, and medical supplies stamped with the words U.S. Army in black letters. The contrast was too much to process. How could the enemy said to be weak and starving have so much? How could they treat prisoners with such care? Margaret refused to eat the bread at first. She told the others it was poisoned. A trick. She told them the Americans were fattening them up for something worse. But on the third day, she watched a young nurse named Liesel Brenner, Helga's younger sister, take a bite of the white bread. Liesel was 22 years old and 5 months pregnant. Her husband had been killed in Italy. She had nowhere to go and nothing to lose. Liesel bit into the bread and her face changed. Her eyes filled with tears. She chewed slowly like she was afraid the taste would disappear. Margaret stared. She had never seen someone cry over bread before. That night, alone in her corner of the tent, Margaret took a small piece of the white bread. She tore off a corner and placed it on her tongue. It was sweet, soft. It melted in her mouth like snow. She had forgotten bread could taste like this. For 2 years she had eaten Kommissbrot, the dense black German military bread that was more sawdust than grain. She had chewed it until her jaw ached, swallowed it dry because there was no butter, no jam, nothing to make it easier. But this bread tasted like clouds, like peace. She ate the whole piece. Then she cried, quietly, so no one would hear. As the women were loaded onto Liberty ships bound for the United States, they stared at the giant American flag painted on each vessel. The sea air was heavy with salt and diesel fuel. Behind them, the coast of Africa shimmered under the setting sun. Ahead of them waited the land they had been taught to hate. The ship was called the USS Joseph C. Lincoln. It left the port of Bizerte on a hot August morning in 1944. Nearly 800 prisoners, nurses, typists, and support staff were packed below deck. The air smelled of fuel metal and fear. They expected chains. They found bunk beds. They expected beatings. They found meals. Real meals. Each day, cooks served 2,800 calories per person. The same standard given to American soldiers. Meat, potatoes, white bread, butter, and even coffee. For women who had lived on thin soup and dark bread for 2 years, the first bite of soft white bread was almost a miracle. Margaret wrote in her diary on the first day at sea, "It tasted like clouds. I did not know bread could be sweet." But seasickness hit hard. The Atlantic Ocean tossed the ship for days. Many women lay pale and dizzy holding onto buckets too sick to eat. The smell of diesel mixed with sweat and salt water. The air below deck grew thick and sour. The Americans gave them pills and blankets. They tried to help, though few words were shared. None of the guards spoke German. None of the prisoners spoke English. A young guard named Ezekiel Dalton, who everyone called Zeke, wrote in his notebook one evening, "They stare at us like we're about to hit them. When we hand them fruit, they flinch." Zeke was 22 years old, tall and lean with sun-bleached hair and a slow Texas drawl. He had grown up on a ranch outside Amarillo. He had never been farther than Oklahoma City before the war. Now he was crossing the Atlantic Ocean, guarding German prisoners who looked more like scared girls than soldiers. He didn't know what to make of them. The trip took nearly 2 weeks. Outside, the sea stretched endless and grey. Inside, the women began to whisper. They noticed that their guards were young. Boys, really. They noticed that some of them smiled when spoken to, even though they didn't understand the words. Some guards even shared chewing gum and dog-eared magazines. One afternoon, the ship's loudspeaker crackled to life and played a song, "Don't Fence Me In," sung by Bing Crosby. The melody drifted through the ship, bright and easy, full of open skies and freedom. The women did not know the words, but they liked the rhythm. It was different from the marching songs they had sung in Germany. It was light, free, full of laughter. For the first time, some of them began to wonder. If the Americans were rude and violent, why was their music so joyful? If they were cruel, why did their guards smile? If they were the enemy, why did everything feel so safe? Helga Brenner sat on her bunk one evening, listening to the music drift through the metal corridors. She turned to Margaret. "Do you think," she said quietly, "that maybe they lied to us about all of it?" Margaret didn't answer, but the question sat heavy in her chest. The ship's captain announced over the loudspeaker that they were heading to Norfolk, Virginia. The women had never heard the name. To them, America was only a rumor, a land of machines, rich food and chaos. A place their leaders had told them was falling apart, torn by greed and racial violence. Now, it was real, waiting just beyond the grey horizon. One night, as they neared the coast, a few women were allowed onto the deck under guard. Margaret climbed the narrow metal stairs, blinking in the cool night air. The sky above was black and filled with stars. And then she saw it. Lights. Hundreds of them. Thousands. Glowing like stars along the distant shore. Cities, roads, ships, all alive in the dark. Margaret froze. In Germany there had been nothing but blackout and silence. Every window covered, every light extinguished. The cities dark and dead, hiding from the bombers that came each night. But here, the night was bright. She stood at the rail, gripping the cold metal, staring at the lights. Her breath came short and fast. Helga stepped beside her. "My God," she whispered. Liesel, pale and weak from seasickness, leaned against the rail. "They told us America was starving in darkness," she said. "But the night is brighter than Berlin ever was." Margaret said nothing. She couldn't. The lie was too big, the truth too heavy. If this was poverty, then she had never seen wealth. The closer they came to shore, the louder the noise grew. Horns, cranes, engines. It was the sound of a country untouched by bombing, a place still alive while Europe burned. The women did not yet know it, but their arrival would be the beginning of the greatest shock of their lives. When the Liberty ship finally reached Norfolk, Virginia, the women crowded near the deck rails. What they saw made them silent. Giant cranes lifted mountains of cargo from the docks. Rows of trucks, trains and ships moved in perfect rhythm like the gears of a vast machine. The air smelled of oil sawdust and roasting coffee from a dockside canteen. Everything was loud, bright, organized. These women had been told that America was poor, full of chaos, ruled by greedy men who let their people starve while they grew fat on stolen wealth. But here they saw a land overflowing with machines and energy, a land that worked. One of the nurses whispered, "If this is poverty, then we have never seen wealth." More than 425,000 German prisoners would pass through American ports during the war. The women were part of a smaller group, only a few thousand, but their experience was the same: confusion, fear, disbelief. American guards lined them up for processing. They were fingerprinted, given numbered tags, and handed clean uniforms marked with the letters PW in black ink. Prisoner of war. Doctors examined them carefully, noting malnutrition, infections, and injuries. To their surprise, the Americans treated them gently, with professionalism, not cruelty. Margareta stood in line, her heart pounding. When her turn came, a tall medic with kind eyes looked her over. He frowned at her weight, made a note on his clipboard, and said softly in English, "You're safe now." She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. It was the first kind voice she had heard in months. Trucks carried them from the port to a nearby train station. The women expected wooden cattle cars like the ones used to transport prisoners and Jews across Europe. They had seen those cars. They knew what they meant. But instead they stepped into Pullman coaches. Cushioned seats, curtains on the windows, overhead fans that turned slowly, pushing cool air through the compartments. The floor was clean, the windows open to let in the summer breeze. Margaret sat down in a seat and stared. She ran her hand over the blue fabric. It was soft, clean. She had not sat in a seat this comfortable since before the war. Helga sat beside her, silent and wide-eyed. Liesel sat across from them, one hand on her swollen belly. She looked out the window as the train began to move. As the train rolled south, they passed fields of corn and cotton, small towns with children waving from porches, farmhouses with clotheslines strung between trees, white sheets flapping in the wind. The prisoners stared in silence. There were no ruins, no craters, no burned-out buildings, no signs of war at all. One of the women wrote later, "I saw people laughing in a cafe. I realized the war was far away here, almost unreal." They were headed toward the interior, to camps built in Texas, Oklahoma, and Louisiana. The ride took days. At every stop they saw more signs of abundance: trucks full of oranges, stacks of newspapers, shelves of canned goods in small-town stores glimpsed through windows. In the evenings they were given hot meals: stew, white bread, slices of pie with golden crusts and sweet filling. To women who had eaten dried turnips and watery soup for months, it felt impossible. Some prisoners began to cry quietly. Helga leaned close to Margaret one evening and whispered, "We were told the Americans were animals, but the animals are feeding us." Margaret didn't answer. She stared out the window at the darkening fields, at the lights of distant farmhouses, at the land that stretched on and on, untouched and whole. When the train crossed into Louisiana, the air turned thick and sweet. Pine trees lined the tracks. Somewhere outside, a radio played jazz. The rhythm drifted through the open windows, strange and syncopated, full of energy. It was almost cruel to hear music in a world still at war. But to the women, it also felt like a promise. The train slowed. A sign ahead read, "Camp Ruston." Barbed wire gleamed in the sun. Guard towers stood at the corners. But inside the fences, the lawns were green and trimmed. Flower beds lined the paths between the barracks. They had reached their new world, a prison that didn't look like one. When the trucks rolled through the gates of Camp Ruston, the German women looked around in shock. They had imagined dirty barracks, chains, shouting guards, cold concrete floors and rats in the corners. Instead, they saw neat wooden huts, tidy gardens, flower beds with bright blooms, paths lined with gravel. It looked more like a small village than a prison. Each woman was given a bed with a mattress, clean sheets, a wool blanket, soap. There were toilets with running water, electric lights, hot showers, luxuries none of them had seen since the war began. A guard joked in English, pointing at the showers, "You've got better plumbing than we do." They didn't laugh, but they noticed he was smiling, not sneering. In the first few days, the women were taught the camp rules. No escape attempts, no shouting. Respect the guards. In return, they would have food letters and safety. They soon learned that these were not empty promises. Every morning, a loud bell rang at 6 o'clock. Breakfast was served in a clean mess hall with long wooden tables and metal trays, oatmeal, eggs, toast, and sometimes bacon. To them it was a feast. In Germany, food had become scarce. By 1944, an average civilian ration was 1,000 calories per day. Thin soup, black bread, turnips. Here they ate more than double that. Margaret sat at the table on the first morning, staring at her tray. 2 fried eggs, golden and glistening with butter. 3 strips of bacon, crispy and dark. A slice of white bread, still warm. A cup of coffee with real sugar. She picked up her fork. Her hand shook. Around her, the other women ate in silence. Some cried. Some stared at their plates like they couldn't believe what they were seeing. Margaret cut into the egg. The yolk broke and ran across the plate, thick and orange. She took a bite. The taste hit her like a wave, rich, salty, warm. She put down her fork and covered her face with her hands. She thought of her mother. Frau Elisabeth Volker, 52 years old, living in a half-destroyed apartment in Hamburg, eating watery soup if she was lucky, boiled turnips if she wasn't. And here was Margaret, in a prison, eating eggs and bacon. The guilt was unbearable. Later she wrote in her diary, "It was the first time I could eat until I was full. I felt guilty for it. The women were organized into small work groups: laundry, kitchen, sewing, clerical duties. They earned a few cents per day, which they could use at the camp canteen to buy small treats: postcards, soap, cigarettes if they wanted them. Some of the women began to learn English from the guards. They practiced words at night under dim lights, whispering to each other, testing their pronunciation. Hello, thank you, please. Water, bread. The air around Camp Ruston was warm and smelled of pine and wet soil. In the evenings they could hear frogs croaking in the ditches. They could hear swing music drifting from the guards' radios. They could hear laughter. Life was slow, but safe. Still, fear took time to fade. Every knock on the door made them freeze. Every shout made them flinch. The memory of Nazi warnings was strong, burned into their minds like a brand. They said Americans would beat us, one woman said later, but they offered us coffee. Doctors visited the camp weekly, checking the women for wounds infections and malnutrition. One nurse, a woman named Rosa, who had been near death from infection when she arrived, was treated with penicillin, a new medicine, a miracle drug the Germans had never seen. The doctor smiled when she recovered. Rosa wrote later, "It made me cry more than pain ever did." For recreation there were books, drawing paper. Even a small orchestra formed made up of prisoners who played instruments. Some of the women painted. Some wrote diaries. Some sewed quilts from scraps of cloth. They began to talk more, laugh more. A few even forgot for moments at a time that they were in captivity. But the biggest change was invisible. It was happening inside their minds. The walls they had built with fear and propaganda were starting to crack. Margaret sat on her bunk one evening watching the other women. Helga was teaching a young girl how to knit. Liesel was resting one hand on her belly, humming a soft tune. Outside, the sun was setting. The sky turned pink and gold. A guard walked past the window, whistling. Margaret thought about the bread, the bacon, the chocolate that would come later, though she didn't know it yet. She thought about the doctor who had smiled at Rosa, the guard who had offered water in the desert, the train with cushioned seats, the lights of Virginia glowing in the dark. And she thought about the lie, the enormous, suffocating lie she had believed her entire life, that these people were animals, that they were cruel, that they were the enemy. But if they were the enemy, why did they treat her like a human being? She opened her diary and wrote, "Day 14 in captivity, weight 74 pounds. The Americans are either the greatest liars in the world or we are. I am starting to believe it is us." As autumn came, life in the camp began to feel almost normal. The guards became faces they knew. The fear softened into routine. Private Ezekiel Dalton, the tall Texan with the slow drawl, often worked the evening shift. He would walk past the barracks, checking the doors, making sure everything was secure. Sometimes he would stop and try to say a few words in broken German. He had been practicing. "Guten Abend," he would say, butchering the pronunciation. The women would giggle. He would grin, embarrassed, and walk on. Margaret watched him. She didn't giggle, but she noticed. He was kind. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He just did his job and treated them with quiet respect. One evening he stopped outside her window. He pulled a small book from his pocket and flipped through it, squinting in the fading light. "Wie geht es Ihnen?" he said carefully. "How are you?" Margaret stared at him. Then slowly she replied in German. "Gut. Danke." "Good. Thank you." Zeke's face lit up. He nodded, pleased with himself, and walked away. Helga leaned over from her bunk. "He's trying," she said. Margaret nodded. "Yes, he is." But inside the question was growing louder. Why? Why would the enemy try to learn their language? Why would he smile? Why would he care? The answer, she was beginning to realize, was simple. Because he didn't see them as the enemy. He saw them as people. The days grew shorter, the air turned cooler, the women were given warmer clothes, jackets, wool socks. They were told that in a few weeks there would be a small celebration, an early Christmas, the guards said. Something to lift spirits. Margaret didn't think much of it. But on the evening of August 10th, 1944, everything changed. The sun was setting behind the pine trees, turning the camp golden. Inside Barrack 7, a group of German women sat on their bunks. Some were writing letters. Some were sewing. Some were just staring at the walls, lost in thought. Suddenly there was a loud knock on the door. The sound cut through the quiet like a gunshot. Every woman froze. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. They remembered every warning from home, every story, every nightmare. When the Americans come hide, they will hurt you. The women looked at each other, terrified. The door opened slowly. 2 young American guards stepped inside. They weren't holding rifles. They were carrying wicker baskets. One of them, Private Zeke Dalton, smiled shyly and said in his slow Texas drawl, "Merry Christmas, early." None of the women understood the words, but they saw the gifts. Apples, chocolate bars wrapped in brown paper, small paper bags filled with sugar cookies. For a moment no one spoke. Then one of the women, a young nurse named Anna, burst into tears. She reached out with shaking hands, took a piece of chocolate and whispered in German, "I can't believe this." And just like that, the dam broke. Women began to cry, to laugh, to reach for the chocolate with trembling fingers. Margaret stood frozen in the corner, staring. Zeke Dalton walked over to her bunk. He held out a chocolate bar. She didn't move. He placed it gently on her blanket. Then he nodded and left. The second guard. Private Samuel Whitmore, a young man with blonde hair and a shy smile, set down his basket near the door and followed Zeke out. The door closed. The barrack filled with the sound of weeping and laughter tangled together, impossible to separate. Margaret sat down slowly. She picked up the chocolate bar. It was soft from the heat, slightly melted. She unwrapped it. The smell hit her first. Sweet, dark, rich, like nothing she had smelled in years. She broke off a small piece and placed it on her tongue. The chocolate melted instantly. Sweet flooded her mouth, then bitter cocoa, then sweet again. The texture was smooth, coating her tongue, sliding down her throat like warm silk. It wasn't food. It was luxury. It was peace. It was everything the war had stolen. And everything she had ever believed fell apart in that single perfect taste. Around her, the other women were lost in their own moments of discovery. Anna, the young nurse who had cried first, held her piece of chocolate to her chest like it was something precious, something holy. She took tiny bites, making each one last, her eyes closed in concentration. Helga bit into hers, slowly, deliberately, her face a mixture of disbelief and joy. Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling. Liesel, heavy with child, sat on her bunk and ate her chocolate in the smallest bites imaginable. She chewed each piece slowly, savoring every second, one hand resting on her swollen belly. Margaret stood in the corner, the chocolate melting in her hand, and wept. She wept because it tasted like kindness. She wept because these men, these Americans they had called animals, had given them something they didn't have to give. She wept because she had believed the lie for so long. But most of all, she wept because she knew her mother in Hamburg hadn't tasted chocolate in 4 years. She was eating watery soup and black bread if she was lucky, boiled tree bark if she wasn't. And here was Margaret, in a prison, crying over chocolate given by the enemy. That night the entire barrack was filled with laughter and crying. The women shared the treats like children, passing each piece around. For many it was the first real sugar they had tasted in years. The smell of cocoa and apples filled the air, thick and sweet and impossible. One of them wrote in her diary later, "We screamed when they knocked, then we cried when we tasted chocolate. Everything we had been told about them fell apart in one bite." The guards didn't understand the full meaning of that moment, but for the prisoners it was powerful, revolutionary. Kindness had broken fear more effectively than any speech ever could. Margaret sat on her bunk long after the others had fallen asleep. She held the crumpled brown wrapper in her hands, smoothing it out carefully. She folded it and placed it under her pillow. She would keep it for the rest of her life. In the days that followed, more surprises came. A local church in Ruston sent knitted scarves and mittens, even though it was still summer. Farmers near the camp donated fresh eggs and milk. American families, people the prisoners would never meet, sent Christmas cards addressed to the German girls at Camp Ruston. One card had a picture of a snow-covered farm. Inside, in careful handwriting, it said, "May you find peace this Christmas, from the Henderson family, Nebraska." Margaret held the card and stared at it for a long time. She didn't understand all the words, but she understood the gesture. Strangers were wishing her peace. The enemy was wishing her peace. One woman said later, "Our enemy became our teacher. They showed us what freedom looked like. It was simple. It was generous." The camp newspaper, printed by American soldiers, included short notes in both English and German. The editors wrote, "All people bleed the same. All hearts can learn again." That fall, the weather turned cool. The leaves on the pine trees stayed green, but the air smelled different. Crisp, clean. The camp began to feel less like a prison and more like a small town. Margaret was assigned to work in the camp hospital. It was a long, low building with white walls and rows of metal beds, clean floors, medicine cabinets stocked with supplies. She worked alongside American doctors and nurses. At first, she kept her head down. She didn't speak unless spoken to. She did her work and nothing more. But she watched. She learned. She saw things she had never seen in Germany. X-ray machines that could see inside the body, shiny and humming with electricity. Penicillin, the miracle drug stored in glass vials in a refrigerated cabinet. Blood transfusions performed with precision and care. Surgical tools sterilized after every use. In Germany, even the wounded soldiers rarely saw medicine like this. Supplies had been scarce for years. Penicillin didn't exist. X-ray machines had been destroyed or commandeered for military use. But here, in a prison camp in the middle of Louisiana, the Americans had everything. One afternoon, a prisoner named Rosa was brought into the hospital. She was 26 years old, thin and pale, burning with fever. An infection in her leg had spread. The wound was red and swollen, oozing pus. In Germany, Rosa would have died. But the American doctor, Captain Frank Thornhill, a serious man in his 30s with steady hands, examined her calmly. He spoke to Margaret in English, gesturing to the supplies he needed. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the actions. He cleaned the wound. He injected Rosa with penicillin. 300,000 units administered in careful doses over 3 days. Margaret watched in amazement. On the first day, Rosa's fever stayed high. She thrashed in her sleep, calling out in German. On the second day, the fever began to drop. The redness in her leg faded slightly. On the third day, Rosa opened her eyes. She was weak, but alert. The infection was gone. Captain Thornhill checked. Her leg nodded with satisfaction and said something in English. Then he smiled. Rosa looked up at him and whispered in broken English, "Thank you." Margaret stood in the corner, trembling. She had just watched a miracle. A medicine that could save a life in 3 days. A doctor who smiled when his patient recovered, not because he was paid, but because he cared. She thought about all the soldiers she had seen die in North Africa. Men who could have been saved with penicillin. Men who had bled out or succumbed to infection because there was no medicine, no supplies, nothing but bandages and prayer. And she thought about the lie that Germany was the most advanced nation in the world, that German science was superior, that the Americans were weak and backwards. But here she was, in an American prison camp, watching American medicine perform miracles. That night she wrote in her diary, Day 62, weight 78 pounds. "They have medicine we never had. They saved Rosa's life in 3 days. We let our soldiers die for lack of it. What does that mean?" In October, the prisoners were allowed to work on a nearby farm under guard. It was a large cattle ranch owned by a man named Harlan Tucker, a weathered Texan in his 60s with sunburned skin and calloused hands. The women were taken there in trucks driven down dirt roads lined with fence posts and grazing cattle. They were put to work harvesting vegetables, mending fences, and feeding chickens. It was hard work, but it was also a relief. To be outside, to do something useful, to feel the sun and the wind. Margaret worked in the vegetable garden, pulling carrots and turnips from the rich dark soil. The earth smelled clean and alive. She looked up and saw something that made her stop. A massive machine painted red and black rolling through the field. It cut through the wheat like a giant blade, threshing and bundling the stalks in one smooth motion. A combine harvester. She had never seen one before. In Germany, most of the machines had been destroyed or taken for the war effort. Harvesting was done by hand with scythes and sickles the way it had been done for centuries. But here, one man on one machine could do the work of 50. Later, during a break, Harlan Tucker walked over to where the women were resting in the shade. He carried a jug of cold water and a tin cup. He poured water and handed it to Helga, who thanked him in broken English. Helga looked at the fields, at the trucks, at the machine still humming in the distance. She asked in halting English, "Why you work so hard, you have so much?" Harlan looked at her for a long moment. Then he smiled, slow and easy. "Ma'am," he said, "that's freedom. You work for yourself, not for some fella in a fancy uniform telling you what to do." Helga translated for the others. Margaret stood very still. Freedom means working for yourself, not for the Führer, not for the fatherland, for yourself. The thought hit her like a fist. She had believed, truly believed, that Germany was fighting for freedom, that the war was about protecting their way of life. But what freedom had she ever had? She had been told what to think, what to believe, what to say. She had been told who to hate. That wasn't freedom. That was a cage painted to look like a country. She sat down in the shade and put her head in her hands. Helga sat beside her. "Are you all right?" Margareta looked up. Her eyes were wet. "We were told we fought for freedom," she whispered. "But we never had it." As the autumn deepened, Liesel's time grew near. She was 8 months pregnant now, her belly swollen and heavy. She moved slowly, one hand always on her back. The baby kicked hard, and sometimes the other women could see the movement through her dress. The American doctors monitored her closely. Captain Thornhill checked on her every week. He spoke gently to her in English, even though she didn't understand. She seemed to find comfort in his calm voice. On the night of October 21st, 1944, Liesel went into labor. It started just after midnight. She woke with a sharp pain and cried out. Helga, sleeping in the next bunk, woke instantly. "It's time," Liesel gasped in German. The guards were called. Margareta was pulled from her barrack and brought to the hospital. Captain Thornhill was already there, along with an American nurse named Ruth Calloway. Ruth was 28 years old, with dark blonde hair pinned back and steady hands. She had trained in Omaha, Nebraska before the war. She had delivered dozens of babies. But tonight she looked worried. The labor was difficult. Liesel was small and weak from malnutrition. The baby was early 7.5 months. There were complications. Margaret stood beside the bed, holding Liesel's hand, speaking to her in German, soothing her, telling her to breathe. Ruth worked quickly, efficiently, her face calm, even as her hands moved with urgent precision. Hours passed. The pain grew worse. Liesel screamed. She begged for it to stop. Margaret felt helpless. She had been a nurse in the war, yes. But this was different. This was life, not death. And she didn't know if she could bear to watch another person suffer. Then at 4:17 in the morning, the baby came. A girl, tiny, blue, silent. Margaret's heart stopped. Ruth moved fast. She cleared the baby's airway with a suction bulb. She rubbed the tiny chest, stimulating the lungs. Nothing. Captain Thornhill stepped in. He placed an oxygen mask over the baby's face so small it looked like a doll. Still nothing. And then, after what felt like an eternity, the baby gasped. A thin, reedy cry filled the room. Liesl sobbed. Ruth wrapped the baby in a clean white blanket, army-issued soft and warm. She placed the baby in Liesl's arms. Liesl looked down at her daughter, at the tiny face, red and wrinkled, at the small fingers curling and uncurling. She whispered, "Clara." Ruth stepped back, wiping her hands on a towel. She looked at Margaret and smiled, tired but satisfied. Margaret stared at her. This woman, this American nurse. She had just saved 2 lives. Liesl looked up at Ruth, tears streaming down her face. She asked in broken English, "Why? Why you save us?" Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she said quietly and simply, "Because that's what we do. Every life matters." Margaret stood there trembling as the words sank in. Every life matters. Not just German lives, not just Aryan lives. Every life. She thought about the propaganda she had been taught, about the hierarchy of races, about who deserved to live and who didn't. And she thought about this nurse who had worked through the night to save a German baby. A baby whose father had fought for Hitler. A baby who, by all the rules Margaret had been taught, was the enemy. But Ruth had seen a baby, a human being, a life worth saving. Margaret walked out of the hospital as the sun was rising. The sky was pink and gold. Birds were singing in the pine trees. She sat down on a bench outside and cried. She cried for the lies she had believed. She cried for the people she had looked away from. She cried for the 6 million she didn't know about yet, but would soon. And she cried because for the first time in her life she understood what it meant to be human. November came. The air turned colder. The women were given heavier coats. And then the newspapers arrived. It was a cold morning when the guard brought a stack of American newspapers into the recreation room. He didn't say anything. He just left them on the table and walked out. The women gathered around, slowly curious. Most of them couldn't read English well, but they could see the pictures. Margaret picked up a copy of the New York Times. The date was November 3rd, 1944. The headline was in large, bold letters. She didn't understand the words, but she saw the photographs. Bodies, stacked like firewood, skeletal, naked. She turned the page. More photographs. A crematorium. Ovens with rails leading inside like for industrial work. But it wasn't for steel. It was for people. She read the caption slowly, sounding out the English words. Auschwitz-Birkenwald. Estimated 1.1 million dead. Her hands went numb. She turned the page. More photos. More bodies. Children. Old men. Women. Their eyes were still open. Her throat closed. She couldn't breathe. She dropped the newspaper and ran outside. She made it to the bushes before she vomited. She vomited until there was nothing left. Then she vomited bile. Other women followed. Some screamed. Some collapsed. Some just stood frozen, staring at nothing. Helga found Margaret sitting on the ground, her back against the barrack wall, her face in her hands. "We didn't know," Helga whispered. "We didn't know." Margaret looked up at her. Her face was pale. Her eyes were red. "We knew," she said. Her voice was flat, dead. "We didn't know the details. We didn't know the scale, but we knew." Helga shook her head, crying. "No, no, I didn't." "I saw them," Margaret said. "In Hamburg. I saw the Jews being loaded onto trains. I saw the signs, Jews not welcome. I heard the rumors about camps in Poland." She looked down at her hands. "And I looked away." Helga sank down beside her. "I told myself," Margaret continued, her voice shaking, "I told myself the Führer knew best, that they must have done something wrong, that it wasn't my business." She looked at Helga. "But children, what could children have done?" They sat together in silence. Later that day, Margaret went to find Ruth Calloway. She found her in the hospital organizing supplies. Ruth looked up. "Greta," she said, using the nickname the Americans had given her. "Are you all right?" Margaret shook her head. She sat down on one of the empty beds. For a long time she said nothing. Then, haltingly, in broken English mixed with German, she told Ruth everything, about the Hitler Youth, about the beliefs she had held, about the Jews she had seen being taken away, about looking away. Ruth listened without interrupting. When Margaret finished, she covered her face with her hands. "How can you forgive me?" she whispered. Ruth was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I can't forgive you. Only the people who suffered can forgive you. Only God can forgive you." Margaret looked up, her face wet with tears. Ruth continued, her voice gentle but firm. "But I see that you're human. I see that you were lied to. I see that you're trying to see the truth now." She paused. "And that's enough for me to help you heal." Margaret stared at her. "War makes people blind," Ruth said. "But you see now. That's what matters." Margaret left the hospital and went to her barrack. She lay on her bunk and stared at the ceiling. She thought about the chocolate, the bacon, the clean beds, the medicine, the kindness. These Americans, the people she had called subhuman, had treated her with more dignity than she had treated her own neighbors. The shame was unbearable. But beneath the shame, something else was growing. Understanding, clarity, truth. She got up and opened her diary. She wrote, "Day 89, weight 82 pounds. I saw the photographs today. I know what we did. I know what I allowed. I have no right to the kindness they show me, but they show it anyway. And that breaks me more than any punishment could." December arrived. The camp took on a different feeling. The guards decorated the mess hall with paper chains and a small pine tree. Someone had made a star out of tin foil and placed it on top. The women were told there would be a small Christmas celebration. Nothing elaborate, just a meal and some music. On December 24th, 1944, the mess hall was packed. The women sat at long tables wearing their cleanest clothes. The guards had given them small gifts: handkerchiefs, bars of soap, pencils and paper. The meal was simple but generous. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, apple pie. After the meal, someone brought out a harmonica. A guard played the opening notes of Silent Night. At first no one sang. Then slowly a few of the German women began to sing in German. Stille Nacht, heilige Nacht. Their voices were soft and uncertain at first, then stronger. When they finished the first verse, one of the American soldiers began singing in English. Silent night, holy night. The two languages wove together. German and English, enemy and enemy, singing the same song. Margaret stood in the back of the room, tears streaming down her face. She looked around. At Helga holding baby Clara. At Liesel smiling for the first time in months. At Ruth Calloway standing with the other nurses. At Zeke Dalton, the tall Texan, humming along. She thought, there are no sides in this room, only humans sharing warmth in a cold world. When the song ended, the room was silent. Then someone started clapping. Others joined. Soon the whole room was applauding, though no one was quite sure what they were applauding for. Maybe the music, maybe the moment, maybe the simple fact that they were all still alive. Margaret walked outside. The night was cold and clear. Stars filled the sky. She thought about the knock on the door in August, about the chocolate, about the kindness that had shattered her world. She thought about the photographs in the newspaper, about the lies she had believed, about the people she had failed. She thought about Ruth's words. You see now, that's what matters. She pulled the folded chocolate wrapper from her pocket. She had carried it every day since August. She held it up to the starlight, a piece of brown paper, wrinkled, faded. But it represented something bigger, proof that kindness could exist between enemies, proof that people could change, proof that even in the darkest warlight could break through. She folded it carefully and put it back in her pocket. She would carry it for the rest of her life. Inside, the harmonica started playing again. Laughter drifted through the windows. Margaret stood in the cold December night and whispered to the stars, "I came here an enemy. I'm leaving a student, and I will spend the rest of my life teaching what they taught me." She didn't know it yet, but the war was almost over, and the hardest part going home was still to come. May 1945. The war ended. Some women asked to stay in prison. Margareta Volker went home to Germany. She carried one piece of chocolate wrapper in her pocket. It would stay there for 56 years. The announcement came over the loudspeaker on May 8, 1945, at 2:17 in the afternoon. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered. The women gathered in the recreation room listening to the crackling voice speaking English. A guard translated into broken German. "War finished. Germany surrender. You go home soon." There was no cheering, no celebration, just silence. Heavy, crushing silence. Margaret sat on a wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap. Around her, some women cried, others stared at the floor. A few whispered prayers. Helga sat beside her, holding baby Clara. The child was 7 months old now, healthy and plump. She had been born in captivity and knew nothing of war. "Home," Helga whispered. "We're going home." But her voice carried no joy, only fear. Liesel, sitting on Helga's other side, asked the question they were all thinking. What home? There's nothing left. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the camp. Frogs in the ditches, wind in the pine trees, a radio playing somewhere in the distance. She thought about Germany, about Hamburg, about her mother. She hadn't received a letter in 4 months. The postal system had collapsed. She didn't know if her mother was alive or dead, if her home was standing or rubble. She got up and went to the small mirror hanging on the wall. She looked at herself in the dim light. Her face had changed. The hollows in her cheeks had filled in. Her eyes were clearer. Her skin had colour again. She stepped onto the scale in the corner of the barrack. The needle swung and settled. 97 pounds. She had gained 29 pounds since arriving in America. 29 pounds of bacon and eggs and white bread. 29 pounds of safety and medicine and kindness. She thought about her mother, who was probably 88 pounds now if she was lucky. The guilt hit her like a wave. The next few weeks were chaos. Prisoners were processed for repatriation, paperwork, medical examinations, photographs for identification. Some of the women begged to stay. Erica, a young typist who had made friends with one of the American nurses, asked Captain Thornhill if she could remain in the United States. "Please," she said in broken English. "Germany is dead, nothing there. I stay here. I work." Captain Thornhill looked sad. He shook his head. "I'm sorry," he said. "The law requires repatriation. We have no choice." Liesel asked the same question, holding baby Clara in her arms. "My daughter," she said. "She born here. She American baby. We stay." But the answer was the same. Everyone had to go home. Margaret didn't ask. She knew she had to return. Her mother was there. Her country, broken as it was there. But on the last day at Camp Ruston, something happened that she would remember for the rest of her life. The guards threw a small goodbye party in the mess hall. There was cake baked by the camp cooks, coffee with real sugar, even a few bottles of Coca-Cola, a luxury the women had only tasted once before. The atmosphere was strange, not quite happy, not quite sad, bittersweet. Margaret stood near the window, watching the other women say goodbye to the guards they had come to know. Some hugged, some cried, some just shook hands. Then Private Ezekiel Dalton walked up to her. "Greta," he said. She turned. He was holding a small package wrapped in brown paper. "For you," he said. "For the trip." She took it surprised. "Thank you," she said in careful English. He nodded. Then he said something that made her freeze. "Ich hoffe, Sie finden Frieden." I hope you find peace. The words were in perfect German. No accent, no hesitation. Margaret stared at him. You speak German? Zeke smiled, a little embarrassed. Yeah, my grandparents came from Bavaria. I grew up speaking German at home in Texas. Margaret felt like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. You understood, she whispered. Everything we said. For 18 months. He nodded slowly. She thought about all the conversations, the whispered fears, the angry words, the slow transformation from hate to understanding. He had heard it all. You heard me say terrible things, she said, her voice shaking. In the beginning, I called you animals. I said, I heard, Zeke said quietly. I heard your fear, your anger, and I heard you change. He looked at her directly. That's why I brought the chocolate that night in August. I wanted you to taste what freedom actually gives people, not guns, not propaganda, just kindness. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. You saved us, she whispered, without firing a shot. Zeke shook his head. Look, you saved yourself. I just opened the door. She reached out and hugged him. He stood stiff for a moment, surprised, then hugged her back. When she pulled away, she was crying. Thank you, she said in German, for everything. Gern geschehen, he replied. You're welcome. She opened the package he had given her. Inside was a small American flag folded carefully and a photograph. It was a picture of the women in Barrack 7 taken by one of the guards months earlier. They were all smiling. On the back, in Zeke's handwriting, it said, The Enemy Who Became Friends, Camp Ruston, Louisiana, 1944 to 1945. Margaret held the photo to her chest and wept. The journey home was long and painful. They travelled by ship again, but this time in the opposite direction, away from America, back to Europe. Margaret stood on the deck as the ship pulled away from the dock. She watched the coast of Virginia disappear into the grey horizon. She thought about the lights she had seen when she first arrived, the brightness, the abundance, the music. Now she was going back to darkness. The voyage took 3 weeks, longer than the trip over because the ship made several stops. The women were quiet. There was no laughter, no singing, just the sound of the ocean and the engines and the wind. Margaret spent most of her time on deck even when it was cold. She couldn't bear to be below, surrounded by the smell of bodies and sadness. She kept the chocolate wrapper folded in her pocket, the photograph tucked inside her diary, the small American flag wrapped in a handkerchief. One evening, as the sun set over the Atlantic, Helga came and stood beside her. "What will you tell them?" Helga asked. "When we get home, what will you say about this?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She watched the waves, dark and endless. "The truth," she finally said. "They won't believe us," Helga said. "They'll say we were brainwashed." "I know. They'll call us traitors." "I know. So why tell them?" Margaret turned to look at her. "Because lies are what brought us here, and only truth can bring us back." When the ship finally reached Hamburg in late June 1945, the women stood on deck and stared in horror. The city was gone. Not damaged, not wounded. Gone. Entire blocks reduced to rubble. Buildings collapsed into piles of brick and twisted metal. Streets buried under debris. The sky was grey with dust that never seemed to settle. The smell hit them next. Ash. Sewage. Death. Some of the women started crying before the ship even docked. Margaret stepped onto German soil for the first time in 2 years. Her legs shook, not from weakness, but from shock. This was home. This was what they had fought for. A wasteland. The processing center was a half-destroyed warehouse near the docks. Bureaucrats sat at folding tables, stamping papers, barely looking at the returning prisoners. Margaret was given a paper with an official stamp. It said she was a repatriated prisoner of war. It said she was free to go. But there was nowhere to go. No trains, no buses. The infrastructure had collapsed. She would have to walk. Her village was 40 miles south of Hamburg. In peacetime it would have been a pleasant day trip by train. Now it would take her 3 days on foot. She said goodbye to Helga and Liesel at the processing center. They hugged for a long time, none of them able to speak. "Stay alive," Helga finally whispered. "You too," Margareta said. And then they parted. 3 women who had survived the war together, scattering into the ruins. The walk home was a nightmare. The roads were cratered with bomb damage, bridges were down, fields were scarred with trenches and shell holes. Margaret passed through towns that no longer existed, just empty foundations and charred wood. She saw people digging through rubble looking for anything useful, children thin as skeletons begging for food. On the second day, a boy no older than 10 approached her. "Brot?" he asked. "Bread." His eyes were enormous in his hollow face. His clothes hung off him like rags. Margaret opened her bag. She had been given a small ration for the journey, 2 days of hard bread and dried meat. She gave him all of it. He stared at the food in his hands like it was gold. Then he ran. Margaret continued walking, her stomach empty, her heart heavier than it had ever been. She reached her village on the 3rd day just as the sun was setting. Half the buildings were destroyed. The church steeple was gone. The school was a pile of rubble, but her house miraculously was still standing. The roof was half collapsed and the windows were blown out, but the walls were intact. She stood in front of the door, afraid to knock. What if no one was inside? What if her mother was dead? She raised her hand and knocked. Silence. She knocked again. Then from inside a shuffling sound. Slow footsteps. The door opened. Her mother stood there. Frau Elisabeth Volker, 52 years old. White hair, though it had been brown when Margaret left. Gaunt face. Hollow eyes. Thin arms wrapped in a threadbare shawl. She weighed maybe 88 pounds. For a moment neither of them moved. Then Elizabeth let out a sound, half sob, half gasp, and reached for her daughter. They collapsed into each other's arms on the doorstep and cried. They cried for 10 minutes without speaking, just holding each other, making sure the other was real. Finally, Elizabeth pulled back and looked at her daughter's face. "I thought you were dead," she whispered. "I thought you were dead," Margaret said. They went inside. The house was cold and dark. No electricity, no heat, furniture broken or burned for firewood. But it was home. That night they sat together in the kitchen by candlelight. Margaret told her mother everything, about North Africa, about the ship, about Camp Ruston, about the chocolate. Elizabeth listened in silence. When Margaret finished, her mother shook her head slowly. "They fed you well?" she asked. "The Americans?" "Yes." "They treated you kindly?" "Yes." Elizabeth looked down at her hands. They were rough and scarred from 2 years of hard labor and deprivation. "Then everything we were told was a lie," she said quietly. Margaret reached into her pocket and pulled out the chocolate wrapper. She unfolded it carefully on the table. Her mother stared at it. "I've carried this every day," Margaret said. "Since August 1944. It reminds me of what kindness looks like." Elizabeth touched the wrapper with one finger as if it might disappear. "We were so foolish," she whispered. The next morning, neighbors came to see that Margaret had returned. Some were kind, some were suspicious. One man, an old Nazi who still wore his party pin despite everything, accused her of betrayal. "You were treated well by the enemy," he spat. "You ate their food, you smiled at them." "Yes," Margaret said calmly. "Traitor." "No," she said. "I was lied to. We all were. And now I see the truth." "What truth?" "That the Americans treated me with more humanity than we treated our own neighbors." She looked at him directly. "I saw the photographs from Auschwitz. I know what we did, and I'm ashamed." The man turned red. He raised his hand as if to strike her. But an older woman, a widow who had lost 3 sons in the war, stepped between them. "Enough," she said. "The war is over. Let the girl speak." The man spat on the ground and walked away, but a few people stayed. They listened. Margaret told them about the camp, about the food, about the medicine, about Ruth Calloway and Zeke Dalton, about the chocolate that changed everything. Some believed her, some didn't, but seeds were planted. In the months that followed, Margaret found work at a makeshift hospital in a nearby town. It was barely a hospital, more like a converted barn with cots and bandages. But it was needed. People were dying from infections, malnutrition, disease. She worked 16-hour days. She had no medicine, no penicillin, no x-ray machines, just her hands and her knowledge, and the lessons she had learned from Ruth Calloway. Every patient who came to her she treated with dignity. German or Polish, Nazi or communist, friend or former enemy, every life matters. That was what Ruth had taught her, and that was what she would practice for the rest of her life. One evening in September 1945, exhausted and heartbroken after watching another child die from an infection that penicillin could have cured, Margaret sat down and wrote a letter. Dear Ruth, I don't know if this letter will reach you. I don't even know if the postal system works anymore, but I must write it even if it stays in my drawer forever. I'm home now. Germany is broken. My city is rubble. My people are starving. I work 16 hours a day in a hospital with no medicine, no clean water, just bandages and prayer. But I'm not writing to complain. I'm writing to say, thank you. Thank you for treating me like a human when I didn't deserve it. Thank you for showing me what real strength looks like. Not conquest, but compassion. Every day I think about the chocolate. I still have the wrapper. It's wrinkled and faded now, but I carry it everywhere. When I'm exhausted, when I see another child die from an infection we could have cured with your penicillin, I touch that wrapper and remember kindness is possible, even between enemies. I don't know if I'll ever see you again. I don't know if Germany will ever heal from what we did, but I promise you this, I will spend the rest of my life teaching what you taught me. Every patient who comes to me, I will see them as you saw me, not as German or Jew, not as friend or enemy, but as human. Thank you for the chocolate. Thank you for my life. Thank you for hope. With gratitude, I can never repay, Margareta Volker. She folded the letter carefully. She addressed an envelope to Ruth Calloway Camp, Ruston, Louisiana, USA. But when she went to the post office, the clerk shook his head. We're not sending mail to America, he said. Maybe next year, maybe never. Margaret took the letter home. She placed it in a drawer in her mother's old desk. It would stay there for 56 years. The years passed slowly. 1948. Germany began to rebuild. Brick by brick, stone by stone. Margaret worked. She saved lives when she could. She held hands when she couldn't. She never married. When asked why, she would say, I'm married to my work. But the truth was deeper. The war had taken something from her. Not her body, but her heart. She couldn't imagine loving someone the way you're supposed to love a husband. Not after everything she had seen. In 1950, she became the director of a small hospital. She trained young nurses, teaching them a philosophy she called dignity first. Every patient deserves respect, she told them, no matter who they are, no matter what they've done. In 1955, she ran into Helga by chance at a market in Hamburg. They screamed and hugged and cried. They hadn't seen each other in 10 years. Helga was teaching English now. She had opened a small school for children. I want them to learn about the world, Helga said, not just what the Führer told us. They met Liesel a few weeks later. She had opened a small cafe in a rebuilt town near the border. Her daughter Clara, now 10 years old, helped serve coffee and pastries. On the wall of the cafe was a photograph, a black and white picture of women standing in front of a barrack, smiling. Camp Ruston, 1944. Customers would ask about it. What is this place, they would say. And Liesel would answer, a place that taught us kindness is stronger than hate. The three women, Margaret, Helga and Liesel, stayed in touch for the rest of their lives, writing letters, visiting when they could. They were bound by something deeper than friendship. They were bound by the memory of chocolate given by hands that could have held guns. In 1975, Margaret received a letter from America. It came in a crisp white envelope with American stamps. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a short note written in English. Dear Greta, I'm visiting Munich next month for a conference. Would you like to meet your friend Zeke Dalton? Margaret stared at the letter for a long time. Then she wrote back immediately. Yes. Please. Yes. They met at a cafe in Munich on a cold November afternoon. Margareta was 55 years old now. Zeke was 53. Both had grey in their hair. Both had lines on their faces. But when they saw each other, they smiled like children. They sat for 3 hours talking, remembering, crying. Zeke told her about his life. He had become a high school teacher in Texas. He taught German and history. He had married, had 3 children. Margaret told him about the hospital, about the nurses she had trained, about the lives she had saved. You did it, Zeke said. You became the person you were meant to be. Margaret shook her head. You helped me become that person. Before he left, Zeke gave her a small gift. Another photograph. This one was of him and his family standing in front of their house in Texas. On the back, he had written, "The enemy who taught me that people can change. Thank you, Greta." They hugged goodbye. Both knew they probably wouldn't see each other again. But that was all right. Some people come into your life not to stay, but to change you. And Zeke had changed her forever. The years continued. 1990. Margaret's health began to decline. Heart problems. The doctors said it was a lifetime of stress and hard work. She retired from the hospital in 1995 at the age of 75. But she continued to volunteer. She couldn't stop. It was who she was. In 1998, she moved into a small apartment near her old hospital. Her mother had passed away 5 years earlier, peacefully in her sleep at the age of 85. Margaret lived alone. She had her books, her memories, her photographs, and the chocolate wrapper, now brown and brittle with age, carefully preserved in a small frame on her bedside table. On March 15th, 2000, at the age of 80, Margareta Volker died in her sleep. It was exactly 56 years after she had first arrived in America. Her funeral was small but well attended. Former patients, nurses she had trained, a few old friends. Helga spoke at the service. She was 84 now, frail but clear-voiced. Margaret taught us that enemies can become teachers, Helga said, and that the most powerful weapon in the world is not a bomb, it's kindness. In her casket, Margaret's niece placed 3 things: the chocolate wrapper still in its frame, the photograph from Camp Ruston, and a small American flag, faded but carefully folded. 1 year later, in March 2001, Margareta's niece, a woman named Anna, was cleaning out her aunt's apartment. She found an old desk in the corner. Inside one of the drawers, beneath papers and old receipts, she found a letter. It was yellowed with age, the envelope brittle. Addressed to Ruth Calloway Camp, Ruston, Louisiana, USA. It had never been sent. Anna opened it carefully and read. When she finished, she was crying. She spent the next 9 months trying to find Ruth Calloway. It wasn't easy. The camp was long closed, records were scattered, but finally, through veterans' organizations and old military archives, she found her. Ruth Calloway, now 85 years old, living in a nursing home in Norfolk, Virginia. Anna sent the letter. Ruth received it on a cold December morning in 2001. A nurse brought it to her room along with a note explaining where it came from. Ruth sat in her chair by the window and read the letter slowly. When she finished, she wept. She wept for a long time. Then she stood slowly, her joints aching with age. She walked to her dresser and opened the bottom drawer. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was something she had kept for 56 years. A chocolate wrapper, faded, brown, creased. The same brand she had given to the German prisoners in 1944. She had bought 1 bar for herself that day. She had eaten it slowly, thinking about the women in the barracks. wondering if they would ever understand what America was trying to teach them. She had kept the wrapper all these years. She didn't know why. Maybe because it reminded her that kindness was a choice. That even in war, even with enemies, you could choose to see them as human. And now, 56 years later, she held Margaret's letter in one hand and her own chocolate wrapper in the other. Two women, two wrappers, two pieces of the same memory separated by an ocean and a war, but connected by something stronger than either. Hope. She called Anna. The conversation lasted an hour. Both women cried and laughed and remembered. Ruth said, "I thought she'd forgotten me. I thought I was just another nurse to her." Anna said, "She carried that chocolate wrapper for 56 years. She kept you in her heart every day." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell her family this. She was the bravest patient I ever had, because it takes more courage to change your mind than to hold a rifle." She paused. "And tell them I kept something too." 2 weeks later, a package arrived at Anna's house in Germany. Inside was Ruth's chocolate wrapper, along with a faded photograph. It showed a young German woman standing in a hospital, thin but smiling. On the back, in Ruth's handwriting, were these words, "The enemy who became my sister, Camp Ruston, 1944. Anna framed both wrappers side by side, Margaret's on the left, Ruth's on the right. Between them, she placed a small card with one sentence, "The chocolate that ended a war between two hearts." And every year, on August 10th, the anniversary of the chocolate knock, she would light 2 candles. For her aunt, for Ruth, for Zeke, for all the people who proved that kindness breaks walls stronger than any bomb. In 2010, 9 years after Ruth's death at the age of 94, Anna received a package from Ruth's granddaughter in Virginia. Inside was a letter. "Dear Anna, my grandmother passed away peacefully last month. Before she died, she asked me to send you something. She wanted you to know that your aunt changed her life too. She said that Margaret proved something she had always believed, but sometimes doubted, that people can change, that enemies can become sisters, that the human heart is stronger than any weapon ever made. She asked me to tell you this. The chocolate I gave them wasn't just food, it was a promise that kindness exists, that humanity survives, that hope never dies." Enclosed is the photograph Margaret sent her in 1945, and a letter my grandmother wrote but never sent. She wrote it the same week she received Margaret's letter in 2001. She was too weak to mail it, but she wanted Margaret's family to have it. With respect and gratitude, Sarah Calloway. Anna opened the second envelope with trembling hands. "Dear Margaret, your letter reached me today, 56 years after you wrote it. I am 85 years old. My hands shake. My eyes are weak. But my heart is strong enough to tell you this. You were never my patient. You were my teacher. You taught me that the greatest victory in war is not conquest, but compassion. You taught me that saving a life is easy, changing a heart is hard. I kept my chocolate wrapper too. All these years, I didn't know why, but now I do. It was proof. Proof that on one August night in 1944, 2 women chose kindness over hate, and that choice echoed for 56 years. You spent your life teaching what I taught you, but I want you to know you taught me something greater. You taught me that redemption is real, that people can wake up from lies, that the human soul, no matter how broken, can heal. Thank you, Greta. Thank you for having the courage to change. Thank you for living a life that honored the chocolate I gave you. I hope you found peace. Your sister in hope. Ruth Calloway. Anna read the letter 3 times. Then she framed it beside the 2 chocolate wrappers. 3 pieces of paper, brown and faded and fragile. But together they told a story of 2 women, one German, one American, enemies by birth, sisters by chocolate, a story that proved the most powerful weapon in the world isn't a bomb, It's a piece of chocolate given by a hand that could have held a gun. Margareta Volker arrived in America at 68 pounds an enemy. She left at 97 pounds a student. She lived 56 more years teaching the lesson she learned in captivity. In her casket, her family placed the chocolate wrapper, brown, brittle, creased from being touched 10,000 times. It had survived 56 years in her pocket. Next to it, the letter that finally reached Ruth, and Ruth's photograph. The war took millions of lives, but in a small corner of Louisiana, it also created something impossible. Proof that kindness breaks walls stronger than any bomb. Margaret's last diary entry, written the day before she died, said this: "Weight 112 pounds, heart still full of chocolate, regrets 1,000. But one certainty, I met the enemy, and she taught me how to be human." That knock on the door in 1944 didn't just bring chocolate, it brought hope, and hope, unlike war, never expires.